Good morning. I'm very happy to see you all from all over. And welcome to our St. Louis Holocaust Museum and Learning Center. I'd like to know if everybody can hear me all right back in the last rows. Can you hear me? So I don't need to have the microphone, right? Okay. I was born and raised in the city of Lodz, Poland. My name is Mary Lou Ruhe, okay? Lodz, Poland. Lodz was the second largest city in Poland after Warsaw, the capital. We had about 750,000 population, out of which about 250,000 were of Jewish religion. Lodz was an industrial city specializing in textiles, in fabrics that our clothes are made out of. In Poland, actually, there was the largest accumulation of Jewish people in the whole of Europe. There was 10% of Jews in Poland. Poland was primarily a Catholic country, and about 80% of population were Catholic. 10% were Jewish, and the remaining 10% or so were different Protestant religions. So we were a minority, but a fairly large minority, as opposed to Germany, where they had less than 1% of Jewish people in the total Germany. My father was a Latin professor. I was an only child, and we lived in a house with a garden in the suburbs of Lodz. When I was a youngster, we could hear on the radio, read in the newspapers about the terrible things happening in Germany, our next door neighbor to the west. It was frightening to hear how the Germans were persecuting their Jewish citizens. And the ones that had already gone through the museum have seen some photographs of Jewish German soldiers during the First World War. They were fighting for Germany. They were citizens. That was their country. They were all awarded medals, etc., etc. But when Hitler came, this was all changed. Jews were not considered anymore as German citizens. We heard about those horrible things when we were in Poland, and we thought, it's not going to happen to us. We live in Poland. Of course, we were very much mistaken. September 1st, 1939, Hitler's army invaded Poland, starting the Second World War. And immediately, the same rules and regulations that had been applied to the Jews in Germany were implemented in Poland. We had to wear yellow stars on our outer clothing. People were arrested in the streets for no reason at all and put in prison. The life of the Jewish people in Poland became very dangerous. The Poles themselves didn't fare very well under the occupation, German occupation, but nothing compared to what we had to go through. Eventually, we started hearing rumors that all the Jewish people of the large city of Lodz would have to leave their homes, their apartments or houses, and move into a separate area of the city, which would become the Ghetto. Lodz Ghetto. The area was in the poorest section of the city. Most of the buildings did not have running water or indoor plumbing. We had to leave everything we had in our homes and just move into the ghetto. The ghetto, as some of you have seen in our museum, was surrounded by barbed wires with watchtowers so that nobody could get in or out. By April 1940, the ghetto was completely closed off, and that was it. We were inside with no communication with anybody on the outside. We were terribly, terribly crowded and in very poor hygienic conditions. Contagious diseases became rampant. Typhoid fever, dysentery, tuberculosis, and people started dying by the hundreds daily. And of course, the starvation. There was not enough food to maintain lives. And the ones that have been through our museum have seen in that model of the ghetto a large church right in front. The church faced outside of the ghetto, and the food supplies would come in through the church. The backside of the church was in the ghetto, so the food was distributed from there to different stations on the inside of the ghetto. We didn't know what was going on outside. We didn't have newspapers, and anyone hiding a radio, which was forbidden, and caught at it would be shot on the spot. So we really didn't have news of the war. What was happening? Where was the front? Who was fighting? I remember that, I don't remember actually anything about Pearl Harbor. Not that we knew anything, that America started also playing a very important part in the war. On occasions, we were undergoing selections. Everybody had to go down to the court. The apartment houses had a courtyard, and we had to stand there, and the German soldiers or officers would come and look us over, and the elderly people, sick people, little children were plucked out and taken away. We were told they were being resettled, but we never heard from them ever again. Eventually, the person in charge of the ghetto, the inside of the ghetto, Chaim Rumkowski, who had been a social worker before the war, he prevailed upon the German authorities to allow us to work for them and in return to receive extra food rations. So anyone able to work had a job. In fact, small factories, large workshops were opened, and we worked on combat boots, uniforms for German soldiers, and anything else they wanted us to produce for them. And indeed, we did receive an extra ration of soup for our work every day, and some coupons to stand in line for some rotten vegetables. So that was our reward for working. Of course, again, people were getting out, being sent out to where we did not know. Some other people, Jewish people, would send inside to the ghetto from large European cities, like from Prague in Czechoslovakia, from Vienna in Austria, that would be sent into the ghetto. Eventually, the Lodz ghetto was being liquidated in 1944. That was after 4 years in existence. We had to leave our miserable quarters. We were taken to a railroad siding and loaded on cattle trains. The trains were moving very slowly. We were terribly, terribly crowded. The trains would stop once a day to allow one person from each car to get out and bring a pail of water so we would have something to drink. After 3 days and 3 nights, we arrived at our destination. It was Auschwitz, the concentration death camp. Auschwitz, in southwestern part of Poland. Before the war, the name of the little town was Oświęcim, but when the Germans invaded Poland, they changed the name to Auschwitz. When the train stopped, German soldiers with guns and vicious dogs were waiting for us on the platforms. Raus, raus, they shouted. Out, out, leave everything behind. We were divided, men on one side, women on the other. And that was the last time I saw my beloved father. My group, the women's group, was divided in two: young and seemingly healthy women in one part, the elderly, the sick-looking, and young women with small children were in the other group. My group was taken to the showers. Our heads and bodies were shaven. We were given one garment only, each, and we were taken to the barracks. The barracks in Auschwitz were huge. They had 3 tiered wooden platforms along the walls, and that's where we had to lie down on. Chaos ruled the first day or two in the barracks. We were separated from our families. We didn't know what was going to happen next day or next hour. In charge of the barracks were women couples, and they were mostly hardened criminals plucked out of German prisons and brought to Auschwitz to run the barracks. A day in Auschwitz looked like this. First thing in the morning, we had to gather at the roll call area outside of each barracks, where we were counted. The Germans wanted to know if anyone got sick, escaped, or died. We were then marched to the latrines, public toilets, which was also a huge barracks with no partitions whatsoever. Upon our return, each one was given an empty tin can for our daily soup ration. And we treasured those tin cans with our lives, because if you did not have a container, you wouldn't get your soup. We were undergoing selections to be sent out to labor camps. And the selections looked like this. A panel of German doctors would sit outside at a long table, and we had to parade in front of them in the nude, and they would point one way or the other. And we went through many, many selections like that. We also found out what had happened to the other group of women, the elderly, the sick, and young women with small children. They were taken to the showers, but there was no water coming out of the shower heads. Instead, the lethal gas, the deadly gas, Zyklon B, was let into the buildings, changing them into gas chambers where the people died in a very short time. And their bodies were taken to the crematoria to be burned. And we could see from our section of the camp the tall smokestacks with noxious fumes coming out of them. And we knew that that was our families going up with smoke. A few of us young women decided to create a substitute family since we didn't have any of our own, so that we could help each other and stick together, which we did. After many selections, some of us, including my group of new friends were taken to a temporary holding camp in Bergen Belsen in Germany. Bergen Belsen, where we were kept in huge tents behind the barbed wires, of course. We were still undergoing selections. We lived in those huge tents. It was a rainy and windy season, so the tents would be torn, and we had a terrible time trying to keep ourselves dry. Across the barbed wires, we could see some old barracks, and we were told that Jewish people from Holland were kept there. Of course, at that time, we didn't know anything about Anne Frank. I imagine that you have heard about Anne Frank. Anybody has? Okay. But we didn't know anything about Anne Frank. Only much, much later, in retrospect, we realized that Anne Frank and her sister Margot were being kept there in those old barracks until they died of typhoid fever. We were still undergoing selections, and eventually my little group of friends with a large group of other young women were sent to the labor camp. The labor camp was located on the outskirts of a little German town in eastern part of Germany, Salzwedel. Little Salzwedel had a munition factory, and that's where we were going to work. We lived in a camp some distance away from the factory. We lived in barracks. We had bunk beds with straw sacks, and the terribly cold winter of 1944 and 45, usually two girls would bunk together and use the remaining straw sack to cover themselves with. We worked in 12-hour shifts, being marched from the camp to the factory, where we were working for the Germans. We were operating machinery, making bullets for German guns. And it was a hard job, 12-hour shift. Each one operated 3 or 4 machines, and we had to keep them in motion all the time. If a machine would stop for any reason, we would hail a German civilian overseer to fix it. The other job we had was sorting out the finished product. And for that, we would sit at long tables with 2 bins each, and we would sort the bullets, the perfect ones into one bin, the ones with imperfections into the other. And when I looked around and didn't see a uniformed soldier or the civilian overseer nearby, I would drop a few bad bullets into the good bin, thinking it was my little war effort. Some years ago, after I had started speaking publicly to students and other groups, I went to Rolla, Missouri, to the School of Mines and talked to the students there. Excuse me. And when I came to this point of my narration about sorting out the bullets, one of the teachers wanted to say something. He said that his father, a veteran, had a memory of the Americans and the Germans shooting at point blank at each other, and a lot of German bullets were duds. So I said, that must have been my bullets. Of course, this sounds funny now. It wasn't funny then. One of the students asked me what would have had happened to me if I were caught. And I said, I wouldn't be standing in front of you and talking to you now. We were working away in the factory until we started hearing cannon fire, the airplanes overhead, and we realized that the front was coming closer. And indeed, a part of the factory was damaged, and we couldn't go out and work anymore. And the railroad siding through which we were getting our food supplies was bombed, and we weren't getting any more food supplies. So the real starvation began, and we knew that we couldn't last much longer. Until April 14th, 1945, when we woke up in the morning in our bunk beds, we didn't hear any more cannon fire, no more planes overhead, and we knew that something was going to happen. We all got out and stood outside in the roll call area and waited, young women standing and waiting. And all of a sudden, the dark green, heavily armored tanks with white stars burst through the double barbed wires, and American troops set us free. And it's very difficult to talk about it. One moment, we were slaves destined to die. The next moment, we were free people. So we screamed and yelled and laughed and cried and just couldn't understand what was happening. At that point, what I wanted was to be alone. After having been together with young women like me for so many, many months, 24 hours a day, I wanted to be by myself. I walked out of the camp and walked the empty and silent streets of the pretty little town of Salzwedel. The trees were in bloom, not a soul in the streets, as if a plague had hit the little town and wiped out the populace. Only white towels and white sheets hanging out of every window as a sign of surrender. And I thought to myself, this must be the best day of my life. But as I was walking, a terrible thought occurred to me that I may never see my dearest and nearest again. I returned to the camp. In a few days, we were taken to much better quarters. They were the German Luftwaffe, the German Air Force quarters, where we had hot water. We could take a bath. We were entlaused, that means sprayed with DDT to get rid of the lice. I asked an American officer if I could get a toothbrush, and next morning he brought me a toothbrush and toothpaste. Nobody particularly likes to brush teeth, but it was a wonderful feeling when I could brush my teeth. I was put to work right away because I spoke English and was needed as an interpreter and translator. There was not only us, the group from the factory that was liberated. There were other people in the area from all over Europe that the Germans had brought to work for them as field laborers, domestic workers, etc., etc., and you could hear dozens of languages. So I remember myself in a huge hangar, standing on a table with a megaphone and speaking to the people surrounding me and talking to them in Polish, in German, and in French, and telling them, we are free, but for the time being, we have to remain right where we were because we had no other means of support. The war wasn't quite over yet. The Soviet armies were pushing westwards towards Berlin. And eventually, the Americans and the British decided to move us, the newly liberated people, westwards ahead of the Soviet armies. So in huge convoys, we were taken west. My convoy, including my little group of friends, and a lot of other young men and women that had been liberated stopped near the city of Hanover in Germany. Hanover. Actually, it's Hanover, but we say Hanover in America. At that time, the displaced persons camps were created, and the ones that had gone through our museum saw the last section of our museum exhibiting pictures from the displaced persons camps. The United Nations had organized the camps in empty barracks, in empty factories, and all the wherever they could find space for a large number of people. The DP camps, displaced person camps, were very primitive, but we were supplied with clothing, used clothing from the United States, which to us seemed the height of fashion, and we were given food, almost normal food, which at first we could not digest. A lot of people got very, very sick because we weren't used to normal food. But fortunately, that was not a very long-lasting illness, and we recovered from it. Germany at that time was divided into 4 zones: the American, British, French, and Soviet, once the war was over, which happened on the 8th of May, 1945. And we were supposed to stay in the zone in which our displaced persons camp was located. But there were thousands of people crisscrossing Germany. We, the newly liberated people, were looking for members of our families. Maybe they were in a different camp, in a different zone. Now I will tell you about a young man by the name of Stephen Ruhe. Stephen was liberated in Bergen Belsen, and you have seen the ones that went through our museum, a huge poster showing dead bodies on the ground and still a few people standing alive. That was Bergen Belsen when it was liberated by the British forces. Stephen and his friend Sam decided to leave Bergen Belsen and started walking living skeletons towards the city of Hanover. On the outskirts, they found an empty clinic that was run by nuns. The clinic had served the German soldiers wounded in the war, but being in their own country, they either crept away or were taken prisoner. So the clinic stood empty, only the nuns remained. So Stephen and Sam booked themselves into that clinic because they needed a recuperation. And while there, they also looked around in those huge displaced persons camps to see if they could find any other Jewish survivors. And they found us, my little group of friends, and some other young men and women who had survived. And we moved into that clinic because we also needed recuperation. Eventually, the clinic became one of the displaced persons camps, and Stephen Ruhe was put in charge of it. And the name of that displaced persons camp was Finnhorst DP camp because it was near a little German village of Finnhorst, which was again near the city of Hanover. We stayed in the displaced persons camp more than 4 years. The people from all over Europe could go back to their homes, to their countries. It was different with us from Poland. We could go back to Poland too, but Poland was by then already under the communist regime, and we didn't want to go, most of us didn't want to go back there. And some that did had terrible accidents to the point that they were killed by the Poles who had taken over the Jewish property and didn't want to return it. So in the camps we stayed. Until, well, we were all young. Some started dating. Stephen and I got married. Stephen had family here in St. Louis, his Aunt Irma and Uncle Alfred. So he got in contact with them, and they started working on papers that might have helped us to come to the United States. No such luck. America didn't want any refugees from Germany until when President Truman prevailed upon the Congress to allow the refugees from Germany to come to the United States. So not until early in 1945 that was possible. We had to be examined by American doctors. If anyone had a scratch, the person would be told, come back in 3 months to see if that had healed. Finally, at the end of April 1949, we had all our papers in order and were able to board an American troop transport ship by the name of Marine Jumper. And it lived up to its name because we had a very stormy voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. After 9 days, we arrived in Boston Harbor, and while still aboard the ship, received a telegram from our family welcoming us to the United States. And we were so happy, we were crying, that after all those horrible, horrible years, we finally found ourselves in this wonderful, blessed, free country. We came to St. Louis by train and lived with our family for quite a long time, which was of great help to us. Exactly 1 week after we arrived in St. Louis, both of us, Stephen and I, started working. It was a requirement that at least one member of each family would have a paying job, so we would not become burdens on the community or the state. Stephen's father had been a dentist, so Stephen knew some technical work and had a job in a dental laboratory, and I worked in an office of a large warehouse downtown St. Louis. Eventually, we settled on our own. Stephen opened his own dental laboratory. We had 2 daughters and fit right into the mainstream of American life. And I remember exactly the date, November 11th, 1954, when both of us went downtown to the State Department building and pledged allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and became citizens. So this, in a capsule, is the story of my surviving the Holocaust. But I would like to leave you with some thoughts. You are all young. You are our future. It's up to you to see to it that nothing like the Holocaust would ever happen again. If you see an injustice being done, it's not enough to just stand by. You must take a stand and see that it doesn't happen. And above all, remember that we are all sisters and brothers, no matter what color, race, or religion, that we should help each other and not hate anybody, and let there be peace. Thank you. Thank you very much. Now it's your turn to ask questions.
How old were you?
I was about 16 when the war started. Then we were for 4 years in the ghetto. Then we went to Auschwitz, to Bergen Belsen, to Salzwedel labor camp, Hanover displaced persons camp, until 1949. So from 1939 to 1949, there were 10 years wasted of my life, of everybody who has survived. Of course, the ones that were dead, they lost all their lives. But 10 years of our lives. So if I'm asked my age, I don't necessarily tell the truth because I feel that I'm 10 years younger. A little metal number on a string now around our necks, and my number is hanging in the glass case right behind the model of Auschwitz, of Lodge Ghetto. I kept it all those years, and when the museum opened, and I donated it there. But my husband did have his tattoo number. Questions? Whatever comes. Well, I tell you, I am often asked what kept me going through those horrible, horrible years. What kept me, and most of the people, I think, what was very important to them was religion. And I'm sure religion helped the people in the camps. For me, it was hope. Hope to see my father again. I thought if I am meek and mild, if I could live through those horrible, horrible times, then my father, who was smart and strong, would for sure survive too. Of course, it didn't happen, but that hope kept me going. Question. My mother died early on, and it was terrible. She got sick. We couldn't save her, but we were able to bury her in the cemetery. So it was a closure. We knew where she was. But of course, I didn't have that with my father, because not until much I had found out what had happened to him. There is a search service in Arolsen, Germany, which is cooperating with the Red Cross. And through that, I found out that my father had been taken from Auschwitz to Dachau in Germany, concentration camp in Dachau, where he died in October 1940. There's no natural death in the camps, in concentration camps. People died by being shot, being hanged, being worked to death, being sick, being starved, but there was no natural death. But at least I knew what happened to him. Questions? Yes?
Did you learn to speak English before?
I would have gone to university. Of course, that was impossible. But I found our former neighbor from the city of Lodz, who was an English teacher, and I studied with her, and I spoke quite fluently English. It was a little bit of a British accent because she had studied in England. Yes?
Do you have nightmares?
I'm sorry?
Do you have nightmares from the...
Far away, and I started running towards him. But by the time I get there, he is not there. And that had been happening quite often, but I haven't had the dream for a long time, so I imagine that I got used to the idea that my father, well, by now he would be very, very old anyway, that he wasn't there anymore. Yes. In a way, of course, it is. In another way, I feel that I'm doing something very important. And if just a few of you will remember what I've been saying and remember this museum, that is a great privilege for me, great reward for me, very gratifying. So I really enjoy what I'm doing. I feel that I'm useful, even though I'm an old lady. Okay.
Were the assets from your...
Well, it is difficult. I'm, of course, aware of everything what's going on. I've read an awful lot of books. I've heard a lot of speeches. I've seen a lot of movies. And, of course, I think everybody should be aware of what had happened. It's not only us that survived, but all human beings should know that such a thing should never, ever happen again. And that is the lesson that we all have to learn and remember. I'm also asked sometimes if I have been in contact with my little group that we created while we were in Auschwitz? Yes, I have. After the nation of Israel was created in 1948, some of the people from the displaced persons camps, from Windhorst camp where we live, were able to go to Israel. So we were in contact. I knew their addresses in Israel. And after I came to St. Louis, newly created family there, and of course some other students with whom I went to high school. And that was an amazing meeting. But the most important thing was what happened 10 years ago. I had traveled practically all over the world, but I never wanted to go back to Germany and to Poland. Until 10 years ago, I received an invitation to a reunion of the former prisoners of the little town of Salzwedel, where we worked in the factory, and the German people who live there now, the second and third generation. Reunion invitation was sent by the mayor of the little town of Salzwedel. And I thought, yes, that was the time for me to go back and see my former prison mates and see what the little town of Salzwedel looked like. So my daughter Janet came with me because I had already lost my husband. And we were treated as honored guests. The Germans paid for all the expenses, the flight, the hotels, etc., etc. And we were I was talking, or many of us, the survivors, were talking to students of a beautiful old high school in Salzwedel. We were taken on day trips. We were taken to Bergen Belsen, which is now a huge cemetery. Instead of grave stones, there are large mounds with signs saying 25,000 are buried here, 10,000 are buried here, and so on and so forth. But the best thing was seeing my former prison mates. It was difficult to recognize each other because we remembered ourselves as young women, and here we were a bunch of old ladies. But it was wonderful to see each other. That's a wonderful memory of the little town of Salzwedel 10 years ago. And the organizer of that group were the best hosts. And another interesting thing, last week I received a package from Salzwedel. They created a museum there and a library, all dedicated to the former prisoners, and it's a wonderful event that happened. Any other questions? Yes?
The stuff that you guys had to take with you to the ghettos, but you were supposed to get rid of it whenever you were going into the camps, did anybody try to look for those?
Yes. We had left a few things of importance with our neighbors who were not Jewish. And after the war was over, my father's cousin, Julian Tuvim, and you might have seen his book in the glass case. He was a very famous Polish poet. And he escaped Poland and survived in Brazil and then in the United States. But he went back to Poland. And he went to our neighbors and found a few things and sent them to me. A book with my mother's writing, that, belongs to Marilla Levy, and a few little things that we had in the house, little things that could fit in a little box. So yes, and my little photo album with some snapshots. They're the only photos that I have. Okay, dear students and guests of our museum, I thank you for coming. You've been a wonderful audience.
Okay, Mary Lou, I'm just going to try to fill in some of the blanks that when people would look at this that they really not quite sure about what timing and everything takes place. Tell me, when you first started talking about as far as, well, like in 1939, how old were you at that time?
I was about 16 years old.
Okay, okay, let's see. Tell me a little more, about your parents, about your family prior to when the Germans came in and invaded.
My father, as I said, was a Latin professor. But I have written a story about the Latin professor, which was published. He had an interesting life because he was active during the First World War. He was, as a matter of fact, paymaster for the division, Polish division of the city of Lodz when he was a very young man. And I don't know, how much time do you have for
As
that?
much time as
You can
want.
always cut out
Yes,
things.
that's right. Marcy will cut it apart however she wants.
Yeah. Well, my father, after graduating from the high school, was Russian. You know, Lodz was in Russia at that time. He graduated with gold medal, and he was hired by a German family to tutor their son, and they went to their property on an island in Baltic Sea while the war started. And my father, of course, he wasn't my father then, was an alien. So he was interned, 18-year-old interned. So eventually he got back to Poland by the way of St. Petersburg, and he enlisted in a militia and was directing traffic because lots of policemen were in the army at that time. And he was directing traffic, and somebody talked to him and said, "What are you doing here?" He said, "Well, you see what I'm doing." That was his principal, school principal, and said, "Come to the school tomorrow, I have a better job for you." So he started teaching Latin right like that, and he had some of the students were his age. And that's a story which I won't go into it. And then he also started attending 2 universities at the same time, one in Warsaw, one in Krakow. And he would just go there for exams, but he learned just from transcripts and graduated from both in mathematics and in law. And he eventually got married to my mother, who was also from the city of Lodz, and she was a very pretty young woman, and I didn't know at that time. And I don't have a good picture of her, because we don't have the regular album with big pictures or anything. But I have a snapshot, several snapshots. And they got married while he continued his studies and while he was a paymaster in the army, because by then it was, Poland was fighting against the Bolsheviks. It was the Bolshevik War. So anyway, so that was their past. My mother graduated from a school in Warsaw, from like a community college, this type of thing. And they were wonderful parents. They both had a wonderful sense of humor, and they were both readers. So I've always been reading from early childhood, and still am. And I had a very happy childhood. I was an only child and didn't want to have any other children. I remember I told my parents one time, "If you have another child, I'll run away." Of course, I'm not sure that they took it into consideration, but I remained an only child. And we spent vacations, since my father was a teacher. We had long summer vacations, so we were everywhere, you know, in the country, in the mountains, and on the seacoast, etc. I had 2 grandmothers. I had lost grandfathers. One I remember, because I was maybe 5 years old when he died. The other, I never met. He must have died just about the time I was going to be born. And 2 grandmothers with whom I was very, very happy. They were wonderful persons. And I had lots of school friends and was a good student. I was a happy child, except I didn't know it. I was just a child. Only once war started, I realized, and now I realize what a wonderful childhood I had.
Okay. You said that, when did you learn to speak English?
When we were in the ghetto, I had graduated from high school, And normally I would have gone to a university, but of course this was impossible. So I searched out my former neighbor from where we lived before the war, and she was an English teacher, and I learned English from her. I had even a little bit of British accent because she had studied in England.
You said that your dad taught Latin. Did you learn
Yes.
Latin also?
Oh yeah, I had a lot of Latin.
So how many languages do you speak?
Well, Polish and English, of course, I speak sort of well. And I had German in school and Latin in school, and I studied Spanish when I was in displaced persons camp. It was another, I couldn't go to college, but I found a Polish officer. He was in the POW, and he had taught Spanish, and I took Spanish lessons from here, and I was quite fluent in it too. And French, my parents sometimes talked French at the dinner table, and I couldn't understand them. So I decided I wanted to learn French, and had private lessons, but I was never really fluent in French.
Okay. Okay. So tell me a little bit. Let's do that one over again about how you learned English and what languages you spoke.
I learned English when we were in the ghetto. I had graduated from high school and had no possibility of going to college, which would be normal procedure for me in normal times. And I wanted to do something to study, so I found a neighbor of ours from before the war who was an English teacher, and studied English with her, and even had a little bit of a British accent because she had studied in England. And I was quite fluent in English.
Okay, very good. Okay. When you lived in the ghetto, did you have any cousins or other family members?
I had my both grandmothers lived in the ghetto. I had a great uncle and his son, who was younger than me, because great uncle was younger than about my mother's age. He was the youngest of her uncles. So his son, who perished all of them perished in concentration camp in Auschwitz, I assume, but I don't know for sure how and what.
Okay. So when you were staying in the ghetto, both your mother and father were with you at that time, basically?
Yeah, my mother died early on. But my father and I lived the rest of the time, almost 4 years in the ghetto, the two of us. And he was the best that could be. He cared for me very much, and I cared for him very much. So.
Okay. You're talking about, did he force you, or did you do any work while you were in the ghetto?
Yes, we had different kind of work. At first, I remember I worked in the Census Department. High school graduates were taken to have that job. We would go to apartments and places where people lived, and we took track of how many people there were, so that the Germans knew how much provisions, food, how many people there were in the ghetto. We kept track of that for a while. Then I worked for a while in that department, in accounting, whatever it was called. And then eventually, when we started working for the Germans, I worked in a metal department in the office for about 2 years until the ghetto was dissolved, liquidated.
Okay. In 1944, when you said you had left the ghetto and they put you on trains at that time, did they tell you where you were going?
We didn't know. I didn't know anything. And we didn't have windows in the cattle cars, so we could sometimes look through between the boards, but we really didn't know where we were going or what was going to happen.
Okay. As far as that time prior to when you had left, I mean, was there any news that you got, however you got it? Was there anything that you had heard from anybody, or was it just you just were
I think we realized that maybe the war was not going that great for the Germans, and that's why they liquidated the ghetto and sent us to die. we sort of thought that maybe if we survive, maybe we'll have a chance. But the people that went to Auschwitz, most of them went straight to the older people, that is, straight to the crematorium.
So basically, when you left the ghetto, then at that time, that was really the last time that you had seen your father.
Yes, when we were divided, men on one side and women on the other. That was in August 1944.
Then tell us again about how long you were at Auschwitz.
In Auschwitz, we were luckily not very long. My group, that is. I don't know exactly if it was 2 or 3 weeks. It was a fairly short time. It was. Then we went through different selections and sent to Bergen Belsen, and then eventually to Salzwedel, to the little town where we worked in the factory.
When you were in, you said you were in Auschwitz a short time. Did you have work details at that time too, or did you just?
No. Some people did. Some people worked in the kitchens, maybe at this time, but I didn't have any work. Most of us didn't. We just didn't know what was going on.
And all this time, you were with that kind of group of. Were these all girls at that time?
Yes, I was only with girls and young women.
Okay. So when you were in Auschwitz, you were 20 years old at that time?
About that. Mm-hmm.
Okay, then tell us a little bit when you went to Bergen Belsen as to just what you did and your life there.
When we were in Bergen Belsen, it was still the fall time. I remember heather was blooming, so the first few weeks were not bad, but then when the rain started and we lived in the tents, it was terrible because the tents leaked or were torn. Excuse me.
Okay, great.
And then when we were undergoing selections, numerous selections while we were in Bergen Belsen. And, some women volunteered to go and work in the woods to chop trees, but we never saw them again, so I don't know what happened to them. But finally, the last selection, my little group of friends and I, of course, a lot of other women were sent on train to Salzwedel, where we started working immediately in the factory. The first group started working the very same night that we arrived. They were taken to the factory. I was in the group that went next morning to work 12-hour shifts.
Yeah, tell me a little more about what work you did in the factory.
We were operating machinery, making bullets for German guns. The other job we had was sorting out the bullets, and for that, I said before, we were sitting at long tables and sorting out the bullets.
Okay. And again, you were the same kind of group of girls?
Yes, yes. We were in the same barracks room. The barracks rooms had about 40 girls each, and the barracks had maybe 6 or 8 large rooms like that. But the group that I originally created, so to speak, in Auschwitz was in the same barracks room. So we grew to know each other very well and help each other.
So they transported you from the barracks to the factory each day, basically?
We walked there. We walked through snow, rain and snow.
And as far as clothing and that goes, the only clothing you had is what you could bring with you?
We were given a different dress, the ones that we had in Auschwitz and in Bergen Belsen. We got another dress, but still one. We only had one dress, one pair of underwear, one pair of shoes. If we were lucky, there were old used shoes. If we were unlucky, then some girls had wooden clogs. which were hard on the feet.
On April 14th, when you heard about the liberation, did you have, I mean, what was your first recollection or your best
Oh, I
recollection?
can see it exactly. We were all standing in the roll call area and waiting. That was all we were doing. And then, of course, the Americans came with their tanks, white stars on them, burst through the barbed wires, and we were free. And
Were the German soldiers still there at that time?
there were a few still left. There, little by little, they disappeared, but the commandant of the camp was standing on the steps with a white flag, and he had not been a bad person. He never hurt anybody. So we told the Americans right away that he was not a monster. So we hope that they didn't really punish him in any special way. I'm sure he was taken prisoner, but he was not a bad guy. People asked us, how were you treated? Where we were there to work, so they didn't beat us or starve us. Not that there was enough food, there wasn't, but it was adequate. So we survived. There were people in other camps that had terrible conditions, and I didn't mention to the students today, but sometimes I do, that every survivor has a different story depending on where they were, what kind of work they were doing, what was the attitude of the guards to them, and personal attitude was very important too. People that were always complaining and crying had a harder time than somebody who was trying to be to be sort of cheerful. You couldn't be very cheerful, but at least take it stoically.
I've got from doing several of these that it seems like the word luck comes into, as a lot of it as to, just where you were chosen to go, where you were chosen to stay.
Absolutely. Luck, that was it. A fairly adequate physical condition. Somebody was sick, they couldn't survive. They put him or her right away into the gas chambers. But most of us were young women, and most of us were fairly healthy. There were some that weren't, of course. And men had much harder conditions and much harder treatment than women. The Germans had figured out exactly what was the lifespan of a hard labor worker, male, 3 months. So because they work in mines and bridges and quarries in all kinds of weather, undernourished. So 3 months was the lifespan of a male hard laborer.
And you had mentioned in the question and answer period a little bit about as to what you felt was the major factor that kept you going.
Yes.
Expound on that.
Yes, I mentioned that I thought that the religion was of help to a lot of people. For me, that was the hope to see my father, and it really helped me, because I thought every morning, I think, well, the little girl, if I can survive it, then my father, who was strong and smart, would survive it too. But they had no idea what they would do with him or what kind of conditions he would live in. But that hope kept me really going, to see my father again.
Okay. And you had also mentioned too that it wasn't until later on that you really found out as to what did happen to your
Yes. Do you want me to say it again? There is a search service in Arolsen, Germany, and they cooperate with our Red Cross. And through that, I had found out what had happened to my father. He was taken from Auschwitz to Dachau in Germany, concentration camp in Dachau, where he died in October 1944. So from August through October, he was still alive. Of course, they didn't tell me what he was doing or what was being done to him, But as I mentioned before, there was no natural death for people who died in the concentration camp. They were hanged, shot, starved to death, beaten to death. There was no natural death, so I don't know what happened to him.
Okay. Tell me, why do you speak here? What is your major incentive as far as telling your story?
My incentive has been, from the start, that the people have to know, and young people have to learn to prevent anything like the Holocaust to ever happen again. And if they are not taught as youngsters, even though they might have just a little bit of knowledge about it, but they might remember it. And when they see an injustice being done, that's what I tell them when I end my talk. They are young, and they are our future, and they should not allow anything like the Holocaust to ever happen again. And we can have a hope, although we see what's going on in this world, and it is not very encouraging. But we have to hope and try to do the best we can.
Okay. You said, tell me again about how you stay in touch with your group, or that you've stayed in touch with them over the years.
Yes. Yes, this is one of the wonderful things, really, that I've had. That first of all, back in 1991, a group of young people, well, by then they were not that young anymore, but students from the city of Lodz, former students from schools of the city of Lodz. It was a huge city. There were an awful lot of students at schools. So there was a reunion there. And I went to that reunion in Israel, near Jerusalem, to a great kibbutz. We stayed there for a week or so. And I went by myself there. And it was wonderful to meet some of the students from way back with whom I was in the same classroom, and a few of the girls with whom I was together during the concentration and labor camps. And then the second time, which happened 10 years ago in 1996, when I received an invitation to a reunion of former prisoners and the German people living in the little town of Salzwedel now. And I was able to take my daughter Janet, with me, because I had already lost my husband. So the two of us flew to Germany and were treated as honored guests and provided with everything, paid for everything. And it was wonderful to see each other, even though it was difficult to recognize each other, because as I mentioned, we were young women when we were together so many years ago, and now we were a bunch of old ladies. But it was great to see the ones that were still there. And the German people who organized that were wonderful, absolutely wonderful. I was interviewed, and most of us were interviewed. And the book that I just received, I mentioned about that from Salzwedel just last week. The quotes from what I was saying and some other former prisoners were saying. And a story that I had written was word for word translated into German from the English.
Right. Okay, I think that's all I got, unless there's anything else that you would like to share with us.
Well, I appreciate that you do that. I think it is important for the future to have this shown to students when we are not around anymore. As a matter of fact, I'm going to speak in Wentzville in January, 7th of January. And the teacher who picks me up and takes me there, already 3 years here in a row, she's going to pick me up, and she said she's retiring next year, but she's still going to do that next year, even though she's retired. So I feel that I leave a little imprint on our students. And I get thousands of letters. And I keep some of them. I don't have room to keep them all, which show me that they understand, that they feel with us, and that they would try. Some of them verbatim say, I will do such and such to prevent from the Holocaust happening again. So it makes me feel very good that they remember and they will act this way. I had many cases where a child was really changed. There was a group of students from a parochial school, and one girl had an assignment from school to do an essay. And she asked me to come to her school and meet her teacher and her parents, which I did. And she corresponded with me or called me a few times afterwards, and she was a changed person. She became a good student all of a sudden, which before she wasn't all that anxious to work and study. So I had many pleasant surprises, which mean a lot to me.
It's very well. I think it's definitely something that has to be heard, and I, from the ones that I've done, I've seen that the students have really taken it seriously, and
absolutely
gotten something out of it. So I think everybody that is doing this stuff is doing
I think
a great service.
This museum and learning center, that is very important. The students learn and they remember. Missouri doesn't have, it's not mandatory in Missouri to teach a course on the Holocaust. It is in Illinois, but the schools and teachers do take that obligation on themselves to send them here, to prepare them first, send them to the museum, and listen to a survivor. And I think it's wonderful. It's up to the teacher and up to the school, because they have to have the buses, which cost money, to bring them here. Of course, places that they don't do it, they ask a speaker to come, and they provide transportation if it is farther away. So I've been speaking to a lot of places all over.
How long have you been doing this?
Ever since the museum started, which was 11 years ago. I even started speaking publicly a few years before that, in a small measure, that is. But I was asked to do that.
Has it ever been hard? I mean, when you first started, was it hard to talk about it, or have you had? Because some people that I know that have done this, some have just started doing it recently, some have been doing it for a while, but some seem like they had a hard time to be able to talk about it.
I had a hard time because I had never really spoken publicly before, and I had to teach myself to do that so everybody could hear me. I had to be able to speak slowly and distinctly, whatever you say, so that everybody could hear me. Because I speak most of the time without a microphone, but when I go to large auditoriums with 700 people in there, of course I have a microphone to speak, loudspeaker to speak. It was difficult for me personally to teach myself to do a reasonably good job, that is.
Well, I think you did great, and I said it's definitely a story that needs to be told and heard, and it's the best way of doing it here in a first hand like this. So,
well, I thank you very much for doing it.
What you guys are doing, everybody's doing here. And, same thing with Marcy. I mean, Marcy does a great job.
Oh, wonderful. Everybody who is it's connected with the museum is doing a fantastic job, including the directors, Don Rich and Jean Cavender. Betty, who is the secretary, she's amazing because she schedules all the tours and everything. So the museum is doing very well. Okay. I'm very proud to be connected with it.